Welcome to the 8th video in this series on harmony. In the last video, we discussed set theory and how it can be used to create dissonant and chromatic harmonies in your music. In this video, we're going to shift things up a bit and talk about basslines. We'll learn more about what their role is, how we can write them, and how chord inversions impact them. Before we get started, I want to give a quick thank you to my amazing patrons, whose support of this channel makes it possible for me to put together videos like this one. If you're interested in becoming a patron, the link is in the description of this video. All proceeds go towards making payments for my tuition. So with that, let's get started. All right, first things first, we should talk about what a bassline is and why it's important. So a bassline is just the lowest harmonic voice. So far in this series, we've been writing all of our bass lines by just simply putting the root notes of each chord in the lowest voice. And this is by far the most common and structurally stable approach that you can take to bass lines. That's because the whole purpose of a bass line is to anchor all the music above it to the harmonic identity of the music. No matter how crazy the other elements of your music can get, the bass line can act as a guide to the musicians to tell them what the harmony is doing. And this is actually why it's a common piece of advice to recommend to musicians just learning how to improvise that they should listen carefully to the bass player. Now, for all intents and purposes, you can certainly continue to use the same strategy that we have been using to write all of your bass lines, which is just to simply hold the root note for the entire length of the chord. However, this effectively regulates your bass instruments to the role of only supplying a harmonic anchor, and they can be used to accomplish so much more. So let's just cover a few basic guidelines for how you can write structurally sound but interesting bass lines. So here is our chord progression. It goes C major, F major, D major, and G major. A short and simple, fun, modal chord progression. Now let's try writing an interesting bass line for it. First things first, the most important thing we want to keep in mind is that we are going to start every chord change with the root on the very first beat of the chord. This isn't a requirement for all bass lines, but it's incredibly common and even standard practice for many genres of music. So it's a good thing to get in the habit of doing before you start experimenting with other approaches. Now it's time to bring a little more life to our bass line. The first thing I like to do is to add a rhythmic motif to the mix. In particular, I like to use my rhythm to build momentum. One simple way to accomplish this is to use shorter notes in the second half of our motif than the first half. This gives us some forward-moving momentum. And conversely, if you want to slow down the momentum of your music, you could just start using longer notes in your second half. Now, your bass line typically should stay in the background of your music, and it shouldn't draw as much attention as your foreground material. So you don't need to go too crazy with the rhythm here, and you also don't need to add too much variation. Honestly, a 2-bar rhythmic idea that just repeats over and over again is more than sufficient for most situations. So that's what I'm going to use here. Now, something else to keep in mind is that, at least in orchestral settings, most bass instruments can't play too fast. They either take a ton of air, like the tuba, or just take a little extra time for the string to produce their sound, like bowing the contrabass. In any case, it's best to try and write a bass line that doesn't get too crazy with super fast rhythms. I'd say that sticking to mostly eighth notes as your most frequently used short note would be a safe option to work with, unless you know the exact capabilities of your players. So here we go. I used the same rhythm twice. The first measure has a dotted quarter note followed by an eighth rest and 2 quarter notes. Then the second measure has 2 dotted quarter notes and 2 eighth notes before repeating the whole idea. So now we have our root notes on beat 1 of every chord, and a nice 2-bar rhythmic motif. Our next step is to add a little more pitch movement in our bass line. A simple but safe way we can try this is to use the fifth of our chords, or even just the octaves of our roots to the bass line. Since the root and fifth are the most prominent tones in the harmonic overtone series of any given pitch, they're both safe options for including in our bass line. We can just go ahead and add them in anywhere we want, but I am going to provide two basic guidelines. 1. Keep the root on the first beat of the chord. We've started with this and we're not going to change it. 2. Use the other notes strategically to kind of voice lead to the root of the next chord by either creating the smallest interval you can between the last note of one measure and the first note of the next, or to move down a perfect fifth from one to the next. So in this first measure, I see we're working with C, and we want to make a transition to F. Since we're working with roots and fifths, let's start by moving this last C up an octave. That way, when we transition down, we have a nice strong movement of a perfect fifth going down. Then, to bridge the gap between the first C and this last one, let's raise the middle C up to a G. So that's a nice transition to F. Now let's see what we've got in the next measure. So we want to transition from F to D. Well, the fifth of F is C, which is just a whole step away from D. So let's take these last two notes and move them down. Excellent, that should do nicely. Now it's just a matter of transitioning from D to G. Let's try following the same pattern we did in the first measure and move these last two Ds up a fifth and an octave respectively, before having them jump back down a perfect fifth to the G. And there we go. Let's give it a quick listen. Wonderful. This helps give our bass line a little more life and personality without making us run into any major issues with tonality or dissonance. And here we have our last step, which is to make our bass line even more melodic by adding just some more conjunct or stepwise movement. Here we have a few options. The first is to start our root notes an eighth note early. This is called an anticipation, and it works wonders for building forward momentum. We can also use pickups prior to any downbeat in the bass line. So that's beat 1, 2, 3, and 4. We just play a quick eighth note on the offbeat to help emphasize the following note. These notes don't need to be a root or a fifth, since they're so short. They're seen as just building into the next pitch and focus more on emphasizing their target note than providing harmonic weight themselves. The most common types of pickups are common tone pickups, which are like anticipations that are separate from the next note. We also have pickups that approach their target note by step, either up or down, and pickups that resolve by moving down a perfect fifth to their target note. These are especially powerful when used prior to the root of the next chord. So I'm not going to add too many here, maybe just one per measure to give an idea of what these can look like. In this first measure, let's add a pickup to the third beat. I'll add the eighth note on E here. It's not a step or a common tone, but it is a chordal tone, and I think that will give a nice color to our sound. Next, I'm going to try something a little more chromatic and just bridge this C to the D of the next measure with another pickup on C sharp. Here, let's try adding another eighth note. This time, leaping up to another D, since that can act as a pickup to the A by leaping down a perfect fifth to the A. Finally, let's move this last G down to C as an anticipatory pickup to the C in our first measure when things repeat. So let's give it a quick listen. Excellent. Now, you can use as few or as many of these little embellishments as you'd like. They're just here to help you bring a little more personality to your bass lines. Speaking of adding personality to a bass line, let's take a moment to talk about one last thing before we wrap up this video, and that is chord inversions. So, chord inversions refer to specific ways of spelling a chord, in which the root is no longer in the bass of the chord. For example, here's a C major chord in root position. If we were to remove the C from the bass line and replace it with an E, we'd get what we call C major in first inversion, or C major with the third in the bass. If we were to place G in the bass, it would be C major in second inversion, or C major with the fifth in the bass. If we were to turn our C major chord into a C major 7 chord and put B in the bass, we would get a C major 7 third inversion, or C major 7 with the 7th in the bass. Before we go any deeper into this topic, I do want to take a moment to clarify a point of confusion for many beginners. When it comes to inversions, it doesn't matter how the notes of the chords are arranged in the upper voices. The defining trait of an inversion is which note is in the bass. It doesn't matter what the order of the other voices are in. You'll notice that each of these examples have a simple C major in the upper three voices. The only thing that changed was the note in the bass. I could have voiced the remaining notes however I wanted. It wouldn't have any impact on what kind of inversion each chord is in. Make sense? So why would we want to use inversions in the first place? Well, there are two basic reasons. The first is to introduce a little more stepwise motion in your bass line, or to remove movement in your bass line entirely. You see, in an inversion, whatever note is in the bass becomes a kind of pseudo root for the chord. It becomes the new note that you want to place on the beat 1 of each chord change. This can be used to great effect if you want to smooth out your bass line and make less leaps from chord to chord. For example, here are two basic bass lines. The first one is our standard simple approach, while the second one uses chord inversions to smooth things out. After listening to that example, you may have noticed our second reason, which is that chord inversions result in different personalities and levels of stability without changing the notes of the chord. Chords in root position tend to sound the most stable. They're the natural, original position of the chord. And if you'll tolerate a nerdy metaphor, I like to think of these as elvish chords. They're prim, they're proper, and they're stable. Chords in second inversion tend to sound a little more colorful while still remaining comparably stable and reliable. I like to think of them as human chords, less refined than elvish chords, but with a little extra warmth and personality. Chords in first inversion tend to sound the least stable and the most colorful. I like to think of them as dwarven chords. They're rough around the edges, but they bring a huge personality to the mix. Now, as a general suggestion for working with first inversions, or the dwarven chords, if the third is in the bass, you typically want to remove it from the upper voices of the chord and replace it with a doubling of either the root or the fifth. This is because the third doesn't appear frequently in the harmonic overtone series of the root note, and can contribute to a muddy type of dissonance to the sound of your music if doubled too many times in your harmony. If you're interested in learning more about the overtone series, please check out my video with the link in the corner of the screen. But for now, just know that if you want to use first inversion chords, it's a safe bet to adjust your upper voices accordingly. Now, let's see what kind of colors each of these inversions can bring to a chord progression. All right, so here we have the same exact chord progression from earlier. I'm not going to voice lead it because that's not the purpose of this video. But first things first, let's start with our first step and figure out what our baseline root notes are going to be. I'm going to start with a just regular root position here, because then we have a C in common over here. So we can eliminate some movement over there. So this would be a second inversion, F major chord. Then over here, let's see what notes we have in common here. We have a D in common between these two notes. So let's do a root position, D major, and another second position, G major, or second inversion, G major. Let's see how this sounds. There we go. So it's a pretty simple, straightforward inversion bass line. All right, we've still got some root position notes in there, and then the inversions are used to eliminate any unnecessary movement. So instead of going from D all the way up to G, we're just staying on D. So our next step is going to add a little bit of rhythmic identity here. So let's just come up with some random stuff. Start with two quarter notes, and then let's say 2 eighth notes over here. We'll delete this, buddy. Then here, let's find a separate pattern for this one. Let's start with a dotted quarter note, eighth note, and a quarter note. Let's see how this sounds. Excellent. All right, so I like that pattern. It's simple enough. Let's just copy it over here. Let's do dotted quarter note, then it was a eighth note followed by quarter note. So now we have our repeating rhythmic pattern. Now let's add a little bit of more movement here. So since we're going from C to C, let's have that G for that movement down. Let's actually just see how that sounds. A couple perfect fifths in the bass line. No, I don't get much of that. Too repetitive. Let's try going down. Let's try bringing that back down again. Alright, simple enough. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Alright, so go down to G, C, then let's go down to F for this one. Go to the root since the C is the fifth. And then, so D, let's go up to A. Then to D. And then let's do G here. So kind of like an inversion kind of thing, like a reflection. We go down here and we go up in the second half. Let's give this a listen. All right, there we go. So now it's just time to add some embellishments. So let's add this is a downbeat. Let's try seeing how that sounds. I kind of like that. We'll try that on the bass guitar. All right, so we don't have a lot of offbeat stuff here. Let's try going with the pattern of moving up again. Let's turn that into a major second instead of a minor second. Alright, simple enough. So not as many embellishments this time around, but it's a very simple, straightforward bass line. Let's put it in an actual bass. And that's it. We've reached the end of another video in this series. I hope you found it helpful. There are only 2 left before we wrap up the series and start tackling a new one on melody. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe to the channel and share it with anyone else that you think might find it useful. I want to thank my patrons again for their incredible support of this channel. I appreciate each and every one of you. I also want to thank each and every one of you who are watching these videos and sharing them with your friends. The wonderful comments, messages, and emails I'm receiving from you guys just help keep me excited for creating new content to share with all of you. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. In the meantime, keep studying, keep working hard, and keep writing new music.